This may be the first of the series. Let me remind you that this is a joint endeavor between EMED, who is hosting us, and then all the masters in the Barcelona area that have something to do, literally, because it's a huge variation, and that's why if you look at the proposal of topics, it's very diverse, that have something to do with the Mediterranean region. That this means from history to water science to international relations, which is what brought us together today. And eBay, as one of the partners in this endeavor, tasked me, Laia there, tasked me to think about a good name to bring to this series of lectures. And then I told Laia, well, I think I could try with Pinar. She hasn't been in Barcelona for a while. Perhaps it's too difficult. She may be very busy. I mean, the last time we crossed each other, it was in an international conference. We spoke only briefly, but she said yes. Wow, super excited. And Pinar accepted to join. I mean, those of you that have been taking courses with me at the Autonomous University or at UATB know that I always mention Pinar as one of those names that you have to take into consideration for anyone that is interested in critical security studies, in also globalizing the discipline. This is also an area where she has been working a lot and writing a lot, and also if you are genuinely interested in the Middle East security or Middle East politics, and you are willing also to think differently and to open up to less conventional theoretical frameworks, well, Pinar is there to help. So that's why many of you have heard Pinar's name before. And some of you may have also read some of the compulsory readings. So Pinar is a professor in international relations. I explained in an unconventional way, but how she approaches the region, the Mediterranean, the international relations. She is based in Bilkent University, the oldest of the private non-profit universities in Turkey, in Ankara, and she has been visiting professor in many places. She has lots of interesting articles and books. The articles, some of you have read them. The book, just to show one, because that's the one I had at home, printed version, so I could bring it. That's the second edition of her book, Regional Security in the Middle East, A Critical Perspective. As a second edition from an older one from 2004. Yes. From 2004. Very rich also in the way in which, that's also how you did with Who's Middle East, an update of the way we approach the region through security studies and international relations. So I think that today we'll see what Pinar proposes. She will also help us think differently about one of those topics we've been exposed to, which is another crisis, so, which is the migration crisis. People said the so-called migration crisis. A colleague of ours, Gemma Pignol, if she would be here, she'd say, no, it's not a migration crisis, a crisis of managing migration. So how the theoretical frameworks that Pinar also has been developing to understand regional security in the Middle East also help us think, interpret, research differently this particular issue, which is the migratory crisis in the Mediterranean. And as many of you are students of masters or international relations, some of you are also thinking about or are writing their final master's thesis or thinking about the next step in terms of Ph.Ds. Pinar also was willing to propose this to you in case this also serves, not only if you are genuinely interested in migrations or the Mediterranean, but also how doing or thinking differently also could help us advance knowledge and more, I would say, It's not pure knowledge, but also being responsible citizens, probably, when working and researching on other topics. So, without further ado, and this is, as you can see, no PowerPoint, just enjoy, just listen, learn and engage. Pinar, you have the floor. Thanks.
Thank you, Edward. This is the nicest introduction that I've ever had, so thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to come back and visit Barcelona. I think the last time we was here, we were trying to figure out, it was in 2010 or 11, right? Edward and I did a project together on European Union's border security management, and that's what we were visiting each other quite regularly at the time. The title of the talk is Whose Security? ? A critical analysis of the migratory or refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. My title already gives it away. I'm going to talk about people's mobility as a security issue, right? But here, whose security is the question that begs for an answer, right? I'm going to talk about it as a security issue, but whose security is at stake here? Looking at the program, speakers that you have hosted before me, the lectures that were offered as part of the program, I noted that there's already been a number of opportunities to listen to diverse perspectives on migration and refugees in the Mediterranean, right? So am I going to deliver yet another lecture on the same subject? Yes and no at the same time, right? Yes, because I'm going to refer to the 2015-16 crisis in the Mediterranean, but I'm going to talk about it as an illustration of broader points that I seek to make, right? So in the sense, it helps that you're already familiar. I don't have to do a lot of groundwork in terms of this clarifying my illustration. But it's also no, right? Because I'm only looking at the crisis for illustrative purposes. I have two main points to make. One is theory related, one is methods related, and that's what Edward was referring to. The theory related point is already hinted at the title of my talk, in the first part of my title, Whose Security, right? This indicates that I'm approaching the issue from a critical security studies perspective. Right? This is a perspective that I was trained in during my Ph.D. research, and I've been using it since then, critical security studies. The method-related point is new, right? Over the years, I got increasingly dissatisfied with what critical security studies perspectives allowed me to see and to understand, right? So I turned to post-colonial studies. From the early 2000s onwards, actually, I finished my PhD in 2000. From early 2000s onwards, I've been looking for different ways of making sense of these dynamics. So I increasingly brought post-colonial studies insights into the study of security. It did help that I had already looked at Middle East as a case study, the book that Edward has with him. I was already familiar with Edward Said's work, right? So it did help that I was coming from Middle East studies background. So as I grew dissatisfied with critical security studies, I reread Orientalism, but this time focusing not only on the subject matter, but also the method, right? Substance as well as methods. The methods-related point that I'm going to make today draws on Edward Said's work, and I'm going to make use of this to study security in the Mediterranean, right? That's the illustration. The method, he calls it contrapuntal reading, and he calls it a method, right? I'm using his choice of word. You may characterize this as an approach as opposed to a method. I'm using his terminology. That's why I call it a method, right? But before I get to these points, the theory-related point and the method-related point, I want to share with you how I got to this question, right? How I formulated my research question, thinking that, some of you are doing your graduate work, you may be interested in how I got to this research question. Now, my research question was also born in Spain, right? Not in Barcelona, but in Bilbao. I was visiting Bilbao in 2015 when the crisis was just beginning, right? I gave a research seminar like this, but I also did a public lecture. When I did my public lecture, there were representatives of civil societal organizations there, and I was actually presenting the results of the project that Eduard and I did in terms of border protection. But I was talking about those results in light of the Arab uprisings as well, because the Arab uprisings had begun and then dissipated in the meantime. This is 2015, right? So one of the questions that I received as part of that public talk got me thinking, right? And it became a research puzzle, and it kept me busy for almost 10 years now, right? That's the basis of today's lecture. And this is the question. One of the members of the audience said, well, be careful. I mean, I can turn your questions into research topics and articles. That's what I'm actually telling you. The question that I received was about, this person said, it's all fine to be concerned about the well-being of refugees, right? Trying to accept as many of them as possible. This is what Angela Merkel at the time was pushing other European governments to do, right? But what about women's security, this audience member asked, right? This was before the so-called Cologne incident, right? That happens during Christmas time. This is before. The harassment and attacks experienced by women in Germany when celebrating during Christmas period. I'm not going to go into the veracity of reporting. There are, of course, issues to do with the reporting of the events. But that's why I'm not taking that as my starting point, but the question that I was asked here, right? The question that I was asked even before that, a question related to women's security, right? A question that many more people asked around the European Union in light of those attacks afterwards, right? So the issue is, if the European Union is going to let more refugees on humanitarian grounds, this would likely produce insecurities for women at home, right? This is because it was suggested refugees coming from the southeast of the Mediterranean, right? Syria, Libya, refugees coming from the southeast corner of the Mediterranean are likely to cause insecurities for women in the northwest corner of the Mediterranean, okay? As witnessed later in the Cologne incident, but also more indirectly by undermining already fragile gender balances, right? Directly in terms of attacks, harassment, but also indirectly. And this indirect aspect I can also empathize with, because it's also happening in Turkey too. Already fragile gender balances are affected by the flows of refugees. I can talk about this more, but let me put this aside for the time being, right? Okay. This is a human concern, of course. It's a humanitarian concern, but it also was as a scholarly concern for me. I wanted to be able to make sense of this, right? My critical security studies background orients me to ask the question, whose security, right? Critical approaches to security point to individuals and social groups, as well as the global environment, of course, as other reference deserving of our attention. Not just states, individuals, social groups, and the global environment, right? Ken Booth says it's illogical to place states at the center of our thinking about security, right? This is partly because states do not always fulfill their duties, right? Consider the Syrian regime's treatment of its own citizens, for instance. It is also illogical, critical security studies says, to treat the state as the referent of security, because even those who seek to fulfill their duties sometimes do this at the expense of the people. Think of the nuclear tests that were conducted sometimes at home, sometimes in the vicinity of island peoples, or somewhere in the middle of the African continent, in the middle of Pacific, right? Even those who care about their own citizens sometimes seek security at the expense of either their own citizens or somebody else's citizens, treating people as dispensable, right? Okay. There's also a related problem. Critical security studies scholars tell us that states are supposed to provide security right? But this doesn't mean that their security is more important than people's security. This is a world of finite resources. We have to make critical decisions. We can't really keep spending money to keep our states secure. Even great powers have to make decisions. Healthcare, or the upkeep of nuclear weapons, for instance. These are critical decisions even superpowers have to make, whether you're going to finance a nuclear submarine, an aircraft carrier, or a tanker aircraft. These are critical decisions that everyone has to make, right? They become even more critical for states that have more limited resources, right? So states' well-being is important. They're there to provide security for people, but it's important that we do not confuse agency, those who provide security, and reference, those who are supposed to be protected. These are all the critical points that critical security studies scholars have made. The answer to the whose security question that they give is human beings, right? Now, this human beings angle was being promoted at the time, right? Whose security, when it comes to this crisis moment in 2050s, human security, right? Let's accept more refugees because they are refugees after all, right? They're fleeing a civil war on humanitarian ground. But then there is also the question that I got asked, right? We can prioritize human security. We can do this on humanitarian grounds, right? But human beings as a referent now is counterposed to women's security, right? We're trying to do some good, trying to respond to the whose security question on human grounds, right? But what's going to happen to women, right? This is a question that my critical security studies training did not prepare me for, right? I did not know how to answer this question, right? I'm told to prioritize human beings, but what happens when you are supposed to care about human beings on the one hand, who are not your citizens, and women's security, who may or may not be your citizens, right? Two different concerns. Okay. What if your critical security studies approach insecures women? What do you do? This was a question. This was an answer. The question that I did not have an answer for. Of course, there are different philosophical traditions that can help us answer this question. I did not go that way, right? That was not the route that I took. I was already, as I told you, reading beyond my critical security studies training at the time, so I decided to make use of postcolonial studies insights to study this differently, right? So I'm already beyond the problem-solving approach to this crisis, but I'm realizing that my critical theory approach is not enough. I need to develop another critical theory approach to this by way of drawing on postcolonial studies. So I decided that I'm going to use postcolonial insights and look at security in the Mediterranean at the moment of this refugee crisis, right? I'm by no means the first person who attempted this. There are other scholars who've been drawing on postcolonial studies to study security. I'm drawing on their work, of course, right? But in this case, I'm looking at a very contemporary case study, right? I'm not looking at the 19th century or the early 20th century, the colonial period. I'm looking at a very contemporary period, the late 20th century, and I'm using Edward Said's method of what he calls contrapuntal reading to do this, right? This is a method that Edward Said develops originally in 1975 book, Beginnings, but he further develops this and uses this in his 1993 Cultural Imperialism book. He's a cultural theorist, literary theorist. He uses this to study it in his own field, of course. I'm trying to see how I can make use of this to study security dynamics. Others have made use of this to study international relations. I'm using this to study security dynamics. Interestingly, he presents the need for a contrapuntal analysis to study connections between things in security terms. I'm quoting him directly here. He says, survival, in fact, is about the connections between things, right? He uses security rationale to present us of the need, to emphasize the need to have a different method to studying things. This is him coming from his literary background. This is not one of his discussions on the Middle East, Palestinians, Israel, Palestine. This is his theoretical work. So this is something that I found intriguing when I read it, right? That uncovering the ways in which we are connected is actually about survival, right? There's a security rationale here, very interesting way. So I took it as a guide to explore how I could approach this refugee crisis differently so that I don't have to choose between women's security and human security, right? That's where I'm coming from, right? Contrapuntal reading as a method, and the rest of the talk is how I try to do that, right? This is work that is partly already published, partly trying to go beyond this. So if you're interested in this, I can also tell you about the part that was published. Right. So critical security studies orient us to ask the whose security question. States don't come first, people come first, right? But what happens when we put human beings, human refugees first? What happens to women? That's where I'm coming from. I try to answer this question by asking another question, right? Why is it the case, right? Why is it the case that we are asked to choose between the two, right? We are asked to choose between the two, I'm thinking, because our understanding of the causes of this crisis shapes the limited response that we have, right? We're trying to go beyond a problem-solving approach. We're developing a critical approach, but that critical approach is already limited by our understanding of the causes of this crisis, right? Now, of course, one way of looking at this is to say the refugees are coming from the southeast of the Mediterranean, right? And where they come from, people don't seem to share the same set of ideas about the status of women in society, right? This is the implication being that human mobility from the southeast to the northwest is going to constitute vulnerabilities for women. We experienced in Turkey, you don't have to go that far. You can travel very little, and this could also create vulnerabilities for women in the society too, right? Now, of course, I know that there may be a degree of hypocrisy involved in such discussions. Women's security does not always make the headlines. It made the headlines this time around. It was instrumental for the purposes of some policymakers, some politicians. I understand that, right? It is possible to contest the sincerity of these concerns and how they were instrumentalized by certain actors. I understand all that. But let's, for a moment, put aside those hypocrisies involved in concerns raised regarding women's security, or the veracity of the claims regarding the Cologne incident. Let's put them aside. There is no denying that the issue was understood in terms of refugees who are coming from a world that belongs to the past of Europe, right? The issue was understood in terms of a group of people who are coming from a world that Europe has left behind, before Europe. They're coming beyond Europe, and this is a world that is before Europe. Europe has left behind. They have behavioral patterns that we have left behind. I'm trying not to say backward, right? Beyond Europe, as before Europe, in Bernard McRae's turn of phrase, right? Beyond Europe, those who are coming from beyond Europe, understood as before Europe. They live a life that we have left behind. Here I'm using Europe with reference to European Union most of the times, but sometimes I move between North America and Western Europe as Europe as well as European Union as well. So if you're confused, I use it with reference to I use that signifying with reference to two different references. I try to be careful about this, right? So people who are arriving from outside the European Union are portrayed as living in the past. They're portrayed as living a kind of life that Europe used to lead in the past, before now, right? Beyond Europe, treated as before Europe. They're treated as before Europe, not only economically, not as per usual in such debates, but also normatively in terms of the values that they lead. The values that they carry belongs to a past world. Now, if this is how we understand, how we answer the why question, right? They constitute insecurities. People who are coming from the southeast constitute insecurities for the northwest because they have values that belong to a past world. If this is how we understand the why question, right? Then we're not treating these people as our contemporaries, right? They're not our co-evils. They don't live in the same world as us, right? We're treating them as fellow human beings, but they're not our co-evils. They're not our contemporaries. Johannes Fabian writes about this denial of co-evilness. Again, if this is how we answer the why question, we're also overlooking the fact that what we treat as before Europe is also the aftermath of Europe. And here, when I say Europe, I'm talking about North America and Western Europe, not just the European Union, right? And I'm referring to this relationship not only in terms of colonial dynamics, which is there, but also Cold War dynamics, right? My colleagues do a lot of good work in terms of studying connected histories, the colonial background, but I'm focusing on Cold War dynamics, the relationship between North America and Western Europe and the Southeast part of the Mediterranean, including the Middle East, and those dynamics and how effective they are. So the issue is not only treatment of some people as before Europe, but they are also the aftermath of that relationship. And that connection is often lost when the problem is set in purely cultural, normative, moral attitudes terms. This geopolitical dynamics get lost. Whereas studying connections in the way that Edward Said advises us to do allows us to recover that geopolitical dynamic. As I said, the colonial dimension is important. I'm not studying that. It is very important. But I'm focusing on the 20th century, right? And this, making use of this method allows me to make the point, suggest the point that refugees who are coming from the Southeast, yes, they do not seem to share the same set of ideas as their Northwestern hosts regarding the status of women in the society, right? Because these are insecurities that are generated by contemporary Cold War dynamics that are still with us in the post-Cold War era. So I'm giving an entirely different answer, not a cultural answer to this question, right? Not just a moral values answer to this question, but a geopolitical answer to this question in a very different way in terms of contemporary geopolitical encounters. Let me flesh this out. I know it's very vague at the moment. Let me flesh this out. Contrapuntal reading is about reading texts, reading narratives that look at the same issue from various perspectives, right? Contrapuntal reading, in Edward Said's terms, looks at the more established texts, of course. We are familiar with them already, right? Counterpose them, read them together with texts that are coming from outside. These may be colonial texts, this may be subaltern studies texts, for instance. These may be texts that we otherwise refer to as the voyage in, those people who have been colonized, who have been, but also who have been trained in the language and tools of the colonizer, who are making use of those theories, sometimes post-structuralist theories, sometimes other critical theories, to write about the same set of events but present us with different narratives. Edward Said suggests to us that we read multiple texts at the same time to discover the connections, as opposed to relying on just one text or another, right? This is often we're often encouraged to make choices between different texts, right? The text of the metropole versus the text of the subalterns. He says we're not going to make choices. This is not about favoring one or another. We need to read them at the same time because, as we remember, survival is in the connection, in discovering the connections of things. So what I do then is to turn to a Moroccan sociologist, Fatima Mernissi's text, and read it together with what we're already familiar with as regards the 2015-16 refugee crisis, right? One body of text is already readily available to us. We know that. I'm putting Mernissi's text next to that, and when I say text, this is actually a series of texts. She has a number of books, but she has also 2 articles that on this particular relationship between the Northwest and Southeast. I read them together, and that gives me an entirely different narrative on the emergence of this crisis. She does not talk about the refugees at all, of course. She's giving us a background to this, right? What she allows me to read here is Europe as beyond Europe as the aftermath of Europe. Aftermath, remember, is not just the post-colonial aftermath, it's also the post-Cold War aftermath, closer to our lifetime. In Mernissi's writing, what we find is an alternative narrative regarding the status of women in the Muslim world, right? This is a sociologist, right, who's very interested in the international sociology of things. She is not just looking at the Moroccan context, she's looking at the broader Arab context, and she looks at the relationships. So she actually does international sociology in a way that many did not do at the time. It's not a cultural explanation that she provides us with, an international sociological one. She argues that, yes, fundamentalism has been on the rise in the Muslim world, right? But she says this is owed to not 6th century texts, but largely due to Saudi practices that were adopted in collaboration with the kingdom's North American and Western European allies during the Cold War, right? You don't have to go back to the 6th century. 20th century, second half of the 20th century at that, right? Saudi practices adopted in collaboration with Northwest American, Western European allies during the Cold War. It's difficult, she argues, to understand the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the 1990s. This is when we started paying attention, right? Independent of the support that these practices received from another part of the world. Why? As a bulwark against, as a defense against the rise, as potential expansion of communism in this part of the world. Let's add the stable flow of oil and the price of oil to this mix as well. So the regime stability of Saudi Arabia is important, not only for the Saudi kingdom, but also those who rely on Saudi Arabia to provide a certain kind of stability, not only in the kingdom, but also in the area as well. Saudi Arabia is key to the Afghanistan operation, for instance, in the late 1970s, but it's also important in terms of trying to prevent what is seen as the potential expansion of socialism, communism in the rest of the Middle East. Mernissi's term for Saudi practices is palace fundamentalism. Right? It's a nice turn of phrase. She calls it palace fundamentalism. It's something that is coming from the top as opposed to coming from the bottom. She says palace fundamentalism originates in the 1950s when Saudi Arabia begins to offer support to non-state actors across the Muslim world. Right? In the first half of the 20th century, she reminds us, commitment to democracy, secularism, women's rights is not superficial, not unique to a marginal elite across the Arab world in general. And she talks about Egypt in particular. The women's movement is very strong in Egypt at the time, and they will play a critical role in writing women's rights into the Arab League Charter, for instance, in the 1940s. Women's right to vote, right to education, right to vote is written into the charter of the Arab League. The point that she's making here is that the prevalence of ideas and behavior that debase women's rights is not inherent, right? It's not inherited. These are not perennial elements of these societies, this culture, as portrayed by both fundamentalists themselves, let's emphasize this, but also outsiders. But these are products of contemporary politics, contemporary Cold War politics at that, right? It's from the 1950s onwards, she says, that democratic and secular ideas in the Arab world began to be overshadowed by this Wahhabi-style Islamist ideas and ideals. And this is in tandem with the flow of funds into think tanks, into universities, but also non-state Islamist actors, right? So much so, she says, Marnisi says, that now few people remember this rationalist tradition in Islam. We don't know about this, not because it is not there, because there's a lot of effort went into not remembering any of this, right? Okay. So especially, she says, from the 1970s onwards, I'm reading here, petrodollars, she says, financed the propaganda that encouraged submission and repudiated reflection. This is a point that she's making in terms of political thought in this part of the world. Right? So I summarized her thinking in a somewhat detailed manner because this is an example of insights to be gained if you go beyond the texts that are assigned to us sometimes, that are familiar, and go beyond that and read other texts together with the text that we're already familiar with. And this is what Edward Said is encouraging us to do. Go beyond the text that we know, but belonging to the same period from a different perspective, and read them, right? Contrapuntal reading. Each of the texts is going to make sense by itself. You can read them separately, of course, but when you bring them together, they're going to make an entirely different narrative on the same subject. Contrapuntal, he borrows from music, right? One tune makes sense, the other tune also makes sense. When you bring them together, you encounter an entirely different tune, which makes a different kind of sense, right? So contrapuntal reading of narratives on the status of women in the Muslim world points to global encounters, right? Through which these alliances between different geopolitical actors are rendering the status of women problematic across the Muslim world, right? And that becomes a problem for women in the southeast of the Mediterranean first, and then by way of migration and refugee flows, it becomes a part of the problem for women's lives in another part of the world as well, right? This is an entirely different reading, a geopolitical reading of the situation that gets us beyond cultural readings, brings us to a geopolitical reading, but an entirely different geopolitical reading at the same time as well. Not a problem-solving geopolitical reading, but a critical geopolitical reading, right? Geopolitical encounters across the Mediterranean as factors in reproducing women's insecurities there as well as here, right? We're not just whose security question needs to be answered in terms of women's securities in both locations, not just in one of those locations. Edward Said insists that this is not about apportioning blame, right? The idea is not to say you're guilty and you're guilty and you're guilty. That's not the point. He says we need to adopt this method to go beyond the rhetoric of blame, to see how our problems are rooted in our connections and in our connectedness, right? So a contrapuntal reading allows us to see that what some portray as perennial characteristics of migrant-sending, refugee-sending societies, right, are actually products of contemporary encounters, contemporary geopolitical encounters, who are in search for security, but in search for whose security? Someone else's, mostly state security, mostly great power security at the same time. So it gives us a different answer to the why question, right? Which in turn forms a different basis to if we're going to think about women's insecurities without overlooking refugees' vulnerabilities. I'm going to stop here. I presented a somewhat complex picture at times. I'm happy to open up different aspects of this theoretical point and the method related point that I try to present. I'm also happy to answer questions or learn about your feedback on any aspect of the presentation. But thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Pinar. As I told you, she always helps us to look at things that we've been discussing and looking and thinking about, but differently. And I think that she managed to do it today, thanks to that, I don't know if it was a gentleman or a gentlewoman in Bilbao who raised that particular question. So, floor is open. In this spirit of conversation, of building together a better understanding of the security of the Middle East, of the security of women, of the security of people. Gabriel, you are the first to take the floor and break the ice.
Thank you, Eduard, for the introduction. Many thanks, Pinar, for the amazing talk. It's always, Eduard said, very refreshing. It always is. Mine is a bit maybe too academic or too connected to the methodology, but I'm very interested in, normally criticizing post-colonial theory for being too literary, too concerned about discourse and about the representation. Do you think that contrapuntal reading actually brings this so interesting connection between the representation and the practice? Because when you were referring to this kind of international sociological perspective of Mernissi was Moroccan scholar, she talked about practices. Yes. And this geopolitical orientation actually bridges the idea of discourse and practice. And we're fed up of listening that post-colonial theory is not equipped to deal with materiality. It is. Do you think that contrapuntal reading brings that edge to this connection? And I've got another question, but I'll leave it for later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we can go.
No, thank you. This is a question that I've been also trying to think through. Whether it is, post-colonial studies is critiqued, as you pointed out, for focusing too much on discourse. But whether this is because the key authors, key scholars of post-colonial studies orientate us toward that, or whether this is what we ended up doing, is an important question that we need to ask ourselves. Because when I turn to Edward Said's work, same with Gayatri Spivak as well, I would say, but I'm more familiar with Said, so let me stay in the more comfortable ground. When I look at his work, it's not just discourse focused. Although he's a literary theorist, although he works with texts, he's not just focusing on discourse. When he looks at text, he's looking at practices, and he looks at texts as theory as practice at the same time, right? So what I drove on this, and this is a framework that I've been trying to develop as well, it seems that we have looked at connections in 3 different ways, 2 of them very well developed, 1 of them less developed, right? We study connections in terms of material connections, colonialism, right? The usurpation of resources. We acknowledge this. This is what political economists study, for instance. I'm thinking of Tim Mitchell's work. We look at connections in terms of identity. Intertextuality comes into this as well. Post-structuralist scholars have done wonderful work in this regard. What Said allows me to analyze, of course, is the production of ideas, right? Connections in terms of the production of ideas and institutions. That's where the sociological dimension comes in. I do not necessarily think that contrapuntal reading is focused only in reading texts. I think there is a sociological dimension there too, not necessarily in terms of what we have done so far, but I think the elements are there that allows us to study such dynamics. You're right in the sense that this is understudied, this is underemphasized, and there's more work that needs to be done in terms of bringing that aspect outside. So let me also think about this. I may write another paper in 10 years' time. Thank you.
Who else? Muhammad.
Thank you. Like, it's more of a contribution, not a question. Actually, like, you reminded me because, like, when I was young, like, I was sitting with my grandmother. I'm from Syria.
Hmm.
She was showing me, like, her picture when she was young. She was wearing a skirt, like, she wasn't wearing a hijab. But right now, she's wearing the whole package. So, like, I asked myself this question, what happened? And then, like, when I asked her, she was like, time changed. But she didn't, like, elaborate. But then when I tried to ask this question more, like, I figured out that there was, like, a Wahhabi wave. Wahhabi is, like, basically the Islamist branch of Saudi Arabia, where, like, the 80s and the 90s was very much implemented the Arab world. And then, like, I didn't really understand why this Wahhabis, like, was implemented that much, but, like, now it's very clear to me, for me. Maybe it was the case, kind of like superpower interest, like to empower Saudi Arabia as like a oil reserve, but also like that brings to my mind like many other things as well, and like also like how psychology was implemented, how many causes that now it's like when it comes to the practice right now it's like there's these causes from like 20, 50, 60 years ago, and then like how I would say like right now how the European people are like, seeing refugees, they're seeing them as uncivilized. That's like colonial perspective.
Mm.
But like what I see that like this perspective, the colonial one, is very much like everywhere. Everyone having this perspective, but like no one is like actually doing awareness for that. No one's like I don't see like in Europe, generally speaking, someone was like going to people and doing some awareness. Any kind of it, even if it's like on a small scale. No one is telling them like, no, this happened because of that. This happened because of that. Not because we are civilized and they are not civilized. There was causes that happened throughout history, and that's the impact of these causes. So yeah, that's my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. But this reminded me of something. Thank you for this. Let me say one more thing that I forgot to mention, although Edward cued me to talk about this. There is increasing interest in decentering the study of this and that, decolonizing this and that. But the methodology that we are encouraged to use is ethnography, right? We are encouraged to turn to, turn to refugees, ask them, right? Go and do case work in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, and ask people, right? But, I mean, I can do similar field work in Turkey, but at the moment, we are as clueless as to these dynamics as people in another part of the world. These dynamics need to be recovered, these connections need to be recovered, and you can't really recover them by doing ethnographic work. Mm. This needs intertextual work in that sense to be able to recover the sociological dimension, perhaps. Now I'm thinking through Gabriel's question at the same time as well. So the method-related point that I'm making is to be able to recover this, we either are going to interview our grandmas, right? Or, look at texts that were written at the time. Egypt is very interesting in that case. Egypt is one of the first areas that Saudi Arabia goes in. Why? Egypt is problematic because of President Nasser. Why is President Nasser problematic? Because he's anti-American, he's introducing all these new ideas. The opposition to President Nasser needs to be encouraged, right? But just encouraging the opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, is not enough. The society needs to be changed. So money starts to flow in even before 1970. Even before the oil riches come in, money starts flowing into Egypt. After 1970, it's all across the Arab world as well. All right, thank you for allowing me to make that point as well.
Who else? No.
Yeah, no. Your conclusions were very interesting in how far you went that I didn't expect them. But you put a lot of context that was good for understand. But at the beginning you mentioned one very interesting event that was the events in Cologne, in that German city. And when you mentioned if these events were real or not, or you mentioned I cannot do this now, I have to start with. But I think that what is really, really relevant is really, as a scholar, try to really verify. I mean, to go to the to how truthful these events were, because maybe I'm talking from the European context, but I think that this view of narrative of seeing migrants, Arab Muslim migrants, and then think rape or thinking is very easy to do. It's something that, and I know a lot of people who are my friends, and they do it very easily. It's something that is so easy, and so many people believe. And I think that, especially when you try to contest that, it's not that easy, because, I mean, but it has like, when you go to these far right online spaces, but you see that there are many like fallacies. Like you see one case of rape on one city, European city, and then you associate this case to the whole population, right? So if one Arab, one Moroccan has to it, every Moroccan that you see, and there are many fallacies that you see all the time, and I consider this like this debate or search for how to really put out these inconsistencies is very important, because I know you had other things to say today, but for me it's one question that I still don't have an answer, how to do it. Yeah.
Underestimate the importance of doing that, but we have to have a division of labor, right? I can't be doing all of this work myself. It also requires looking critically at media practices, right? And it requires different kinds of skills to be able to do this. When I was preparing this presentation, I went back to see whether there is more critical analysis of that series of events. So I went back, right? But remember, my starting point is even before those attacks, and I'm putting it in quotation marks. My starting point is even before that happened. I was presenting here in Spain, and someone asked me this question even before that. And the issue is not always in terms of direct attacks either. There is already the indirect, yeah? Remember, Galtung distinguished between direct violence and indirect violence. There is the indirect dimension as well. Women's rights may be jeopardized because now you're encountering a different way of treating women in the same society. This is also happening in Turkey too. So there is that aspect. Again, I'm not saying this is not important. I'm saying two different things. One, my starting point is already different. The second, we really need someone who's skilled to do that kind of research, and I'm not that. But I'm a good consumer of that research. Mm-hmm. So when it's out there, I try and make use of it as possible. It's an important point to make. Thank you.
Someone else, otherwise I'll go. Because I have to, and then I give you also time if you have also additional questions. The first one is one that you have implicitly raised, which is Turkish visions to this puzzle, and how also the society in Turkey is also reflecting on similar lines. And then, but it's also different history and a different understanding. How, if you could elaborate a little bit also on how to transpose those, the challenge and this puzzle that someone in Bilbao put, that perhaps someone else in Gaziantep could have raised as well. Is there any peculiarity, which are the common elements and the differences? The other, it's more about the methodology or the purpose of doing research. So I think that with what you have presented, it helps us understand why the question is being asked, and eventually why it can be and how it can be instrumentalized. The thing is, in this element of what I was saying of being a responsible citizen, and perhaps this has to do also with the division of labor, where our work should stop, in the sense that is it about raising making people understand why this question is being raised so that they can think critically about the terms of the debate? Or are we as researchers / committed citizens supposed to do more, and how? I know it's also a meta question, but one that I know once also a colleague of us who is not here, Christina, at the Autonoma once raised. So I wanted to, I mean,
Okay.
it was really into the substance also of what you
Yeah,
were
it's
saying.
2.5 questions really, Edward.
Really? Okay.
Okay, thank you.
That gives them more time to think about them.
Okay, thank you. I've raised the Turkish context, and this is not research that I have done, but this is based purely on observations. And I was giving the example of the Turkish context to say that this is not, this is maybe a concern across Muslim societies as well. It's not just, you know, Muslims versus non-Muslims kind of counterposition of different societies. This was an issue that was raised early on. I don't know whether it was addressed or not, right? So this is something that someone has to look into. Remember, I distinguish between direct violence and indirect violence. Direct violence is alleged attacks, right? Indirect violence is when women's rights may come to be questioned because of different practices being observed. What we saw in Turkey at the time was a slight increase in polygamy. I'm going to name it, right? How many wives can a man have? The question is resolved in the Republican period, brought down to 1, right? Whereas according to some interpretations, it can go up to 4. Now, different practices, when they come together with people who are coming from different backgrounds, where norms may be exercised differently. I'm not saying this is how it works in Syria, right? It may work in different contexts in Turkey too, right? There's law and there's behavior. They are not always meeting. What we saw is increasingly, and slight increasing the number of second and third wives. This is, to a certain extent, someone may explain this for protection purposes as well, right? Women need protection. They're increasingly turning to accepting this as a solution to their insecurities. But this is another women's insecurity. When the system does not provide women with security, they're turning to a different kind of, very traditional kind of security search. That's the Turkish context, right? Intra-Muslim dynamics in this case. There are different ways of practicing Islam in different parts of the Middle East, across the Middle East as well. But again, this is purely based on observation. I don't know whether it was addressed or not. This was what we were reading early on in the Syrian. During the Syrian civil war. So I need to actually read up on this, do more research perhaps myself. Regarding the second and the half question, methodology related, I've been writing on this for a while now. This is the second piece that I have written on how we can incorporate Said's method to study international relations in general, and this time security in particular. And every time I present this, it comes across as too much work, right? When I present this, someone always, this is not what you're asking, Edward, I recognize that, but someone in the audience always says, well, it's difficult enough to keep up with all these articles and books being published. Now do we have to go to another part of the world and then learn a new language and keep up with another literature? It's difficult enough. That's almost always the question that comes to at least one audience member's minds. It is not really that daunting, in the sense that these are works that are actually readily available, and often it does not require learning a new language. There's a lot of material already either published in English or translated into English if you only know one language outside your own native language, right? You can do it in French, I trust, or in Spanish or in Arabic. It's a matter of going beyond, and this is in direct response to the question this time, this is a matter of going beyond sources that are readily available. to you, right? Go beyond this and don't take the shortcut. Remember, the shortcut is to go and do interviews, right? With people, go and do interviews. There's a lot of scholarship already there that we don't always consult. Right? I teach a course on regional security in the Middle East. It's not that difficult to present regional perspectives on regional security in the Middle East. It's really not that difficult. There's a lot of material in Turkish, in English, in Arabic, depending on what, in Spanish, in French, depending on what language you're familiar. It's a matter of just finding out about these resources. It's now easier than to the past, but I was able to write that book sitting in Wales, in Aberystwyth, relying entirely on English resources. And I was not using contrapuntal reading at the time. There's a lot of material already existing. It's a matter of looking for sources. It is not, I mean, I would call it not responsible citizenship, but responsible scholarship maybe, right? To go beyond sources that we're comfortable with and counterpoise them with sources, put next to each other sources that we're comfortable with and the rest that are not easy to locate, but they exist out there. They read different, right? They're not perhaps written in the same manner as we are used to, right? It does not start out sometimes by saying, this is my argument, this is my methodology, this is how I'm going to present my argument. So the way it's structured may be different. It may not be as easy to access them, right? But it is very rewarding. That's the point that I'm trying to make, I guess.
Good.
Yeah?
Yeah, Giovanni. So this will be the last round.
Okay.
Pinar woke up at 1 o'clock in the morning, so that's why.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had any examples of other comparable cases of instrumentalization of religion, especially in the contemporary setting. I can think of at least one example, but I'm more interested in
Which one?
Evangelicism in the US would be an example of a top-down, very similar to palace fundamentalism. It's not a very well-known story, but I assure you it's very, very similar. So I was wondering if you knew about that or about other cases that are similar, because I think it's interesting for people to go beyond the Middle East and say this is not something characteristic of Middle Eastern people, it's a characteristic of people to be manipulated through religion. So I was wondering if you had any comparable cases that you knew about.
No, but I'd be very interested in finding out about the case that you had in mind. This is the one I am familiar with, but remember, I'm not starting from a women's security perspective either. If I kept that focus, that would be interesting to look at comparable cases. I'm looking at this in terms of the utility of this method. So if you are thinking of this in terms of the utility of that method, that would be wonderful to find out about, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may, I think Giovanni's point is and I have that, but because also we see also how there has been a deliberate attempt to promote evangelism in Latin America,
Okay.
who has also had an effect in terms of women's rights
Yeah, okay.
in Latin America.
So we'll start in the US, and
Yeah.
there's a methodology that's been reapplied in Latin America.
Okay.
So that this is an issue interesting to discuss also with Brazilian colleagues, as Pinar is also working a lot, and because we
Okay.
saw also the practical consequences of that in Brazil.
Thank you.
Hi, hello. Thank you for your introduction. It was really interesting. But you have been talking about connections all the time. It was such a main issue here. And it raised me, well, a question about it. Like, you've talked about connections through insecurity, and I wanted to ask you if you have seen any case of insecurity, connection through insecurity turn into security in your work? Like, that it's changed.
Do you mind saying it again? Connection?
Like, the connections you were talking about, it was really related to insecurity, but have you seen it change? Like, it has changed to the security one, like, it's not about insecurity anymore, but it has more a positive comeback or something related to it.
This is something I need to think about. Maybe that's the next article. I haven't, really. But the point that we're trying to reach, not I'm trying to make, but the point that we're trying to reach is that by way of adopting these critical perspectives. Remember, I started with the problem-solving approach. I introduced one critical approach, and I said we need more. Yeah, we need critical theory 0.2, right? The idea is to get to security. It's never a clear-cut endpoint, but the idea is to get to there. So to be able to see something on the horizon, as opposed to thinking that all these are differences, the only solution is to keep these people there and keep people separate, because that would be the only solution that we would be able to envisage if we stay with our own problem-solving approaches, right? So you're asking me if there is anything positive to conclude, and a positive note to conclude on. I'm afraid not. Not tonight. Not with reference to this case. No, not yet.
So, unless I see any other hand raised, nope. So thank you all for attending this session. So now Pinar also has lots of things to think about, thanks to us, thanks to you. And we certainly have also new ways of looking at the issues we have already been looking, but probably through other lenses.
Yeah.
And this is what theory provides us, with plenty of different lenses that allows us to look differently and to look better depending on what the object we are looking at, or what do we want to see in this object. And you, in that sense, also help us look at an object that we've already been watching to, at least the crowd in this room, and do it differently. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you.
This is evangelism, Mr.